All right, everyone. Thank you for coming to our panel. I feel like everyone's been very engineering minded, and here we are going to talk about trust and love and like have kind of a psychological type panel. But before we dive in, I want to have everyone introduce themselves. So I'm Sheena Smith. I run strategy for a company called Spend Matters. We help people in procurement, supply chain, and finance find best fit technology. So we'll tell you the real dirt on what all those vendors out there in the hall can actually do versus what they say they can do. Anyway, I'd love to pass it to Tiffanie. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I am Tiffanie Stanard, CEO and founder of Panelists. We are a technology company based in Philadelphia. I've been in vendor management for almost 20 years, started as a corporate employee turned consultant. I've worked with really large companies throughout the years, helping them just basically build better relationships with their suppliers, and then developed a platform that really helps companies not only use data to make a better purchasing decision, but also creating something that is buyer and vendor friendly, which I have not seen yet. Thank you.
Jung.
Hi. Well, thank you so much for having me today. My name is Jung Yoon. I'm a senior vice president at Michael Kors, and Michael Kors is a fashion brand that's based in New York City. I manage from technical design, commercialization, materials, procurement to production to quality. So I manage everything from sort of the inception, supporting design, create the product, all the way to having the goods be ready at the port. And my logistics partner takes over from there.
Wonderful. And Donna.
Hello, thank you. My name is Donna Lanzetta. I'm CEO and founder of Mana Fish Farms and Mana Seafood Blockchain. Mana Fish Farms is pursuing ocean permitting for an offshore farm in Florida, New York, and looking at Puerto Rico. We are also, with Mana Seafood Blockchain, moving seafood through using the blockchain technology, studying the movement of seafood in the supply chain.
So two very different supply chains we have here, which I thought was such a cool way to think about relationships with suppliers. I wanted to ask the audience, how many of you have suppliers you would consider strategic? Raise of hands. Okay, everyone's hands should go up. Okay. And then when you think about what makes those suppliers strategic, have you thought about the relational aspects of those? So the behaviors behind that strategic supplier. Raise your hand. Yes? Okay. Oh, thank goodness. Okay. And when we're thinking about trust with our suppliers, I wanted to talk to the panel about what does trust really actually mean? Because if we're doing business with these people, we assume we're not going to do business unless we trust them. We would hope, right? But let's go ahead and start with you, Tiffanie. What does trust really mean in a supplier relationship?
So depending on who you speak to, trust can mean a lot of things. Trust can be, I trust you until you do something wrong. Trust can be, you have to build that trust over time. Trust can be, hey, my colleagues have been utilizing this supplier, so I trust them. Mm-hmm. Or externally, colleagues in another company, maybe the same title, have been using them or have heard great things about them, and now they have that kind of initial trust. And I think it's really important to look at, what your aspects of trust are. I always say, the way you trust people professionally, you trust them personally and vice versa, right? So it's making sure that you're looking at all aspects of how you initially trust a supplier and making sure that you're also using data and not just your own kind of personal opinions of that company initially as well.
So the bias aspect.
The bias. I say a mixture between biases and habits because people don't always like when you say biases.
Fair. And so, Jung, what does trust mean in your role?
Sure. I think trust goes both ways, and that it has to be a mutual trust. Internally, I speak to my team quite a bit about the trust and the respect that we have to have with each other within the team to collaborate better. But also externally with the suppliers, trust also has to be mutual and respectful, and that I consider my suppliers also partners. And it is true that the trust can be built over time. I mean, you can't blindly trust someone. But trust is really, I think, assuming the positive intent I think that's what I would say. So within different industry and different circumstances, there are so many different ways to express the trust and expectations. But really, as a foundation, just assuming the positive intent, I think that is to me as a trust.
The basic integrity. So someone will get the goods there on time as promised. Someone will do what they said they were going to do.
Right. Same thing for the team. Same thing for the suppliers.
Okay. In your line, Donna, it's a little bit different because you're trusting that what you're being served on a plate is actually what it is. Can you walk the audience through that? What does trust mean for you?
There's a lot of trust issues surrounding seafood, or I should say mistrust issues. We have issues surrounding if it's wild capture fish, what type of gear did that fisherman use? Where did they catch it? Was it legally caught within their quota limits? Did that particular fishing enterprise use slave labor or some type of workforce violations? And then in the farmed area, there's an issue of how was that fish farmed? What did it eat for feed? And a lot of it also goes to the provenance of the seafood. Where was it from? And to be able to place trust in a place like on the blockchain where it can't be changed. So the date that that fish was harvested, the date it was harvested, and it's not a week later. How long it was frozen is how long it was frozen, right? And this really goes to the future of seafood, I think, what we're doing.
So a lot of different definitions around trust, but we all agree that it kind of comes back to integrity, right? But with integrity, I kind of want to flip it and take everyone onto the dark side right now is there's risk. There's risk in trusting someone, no matter how strong and solid the relationship is. And so in this world where we want to have these dark warehouses and we want to remove people from a lot of the equations of what we're dealing with, I think when you're still working with suppliers, there's still that relational aspect. But I wanted to talk to you about what are some of the inherent risks in trusting someone or something in your supply chain? So, Tiffanie, let's you.
Sure. So I always say, in business in general is risky, whatever decision you're making, and especially when it's going to cost you money.
Yeah.
Right? When you're choosing a supplier, and I always say they are part of your external team, like she said, your partners, right? They're helping your customers, they're helping your internal team, do their jobs. So you don't know, if they just went bankrupt. You don't know if, they have unlawful things that they're doing within their company. A lot of that data, unfortunately, is not always forefront for people. A lot of people have 6 months, 7 months, 12-month data from those suppliers, which makes it difficult to know if the company that you're working with will be at risk now or 12 months from now after you make that decision. So, within stimulus, I started to see that throughout the years and making sure that we're giving companies the data to make that decision quickly. And even if it does not work out, you still have a full data plan, a full data report of why it did not work out or what happened with that company. You can present that information to your team because at the end of the day, you don't know if you're going to have a bad supplier until you do. No different than you don't know if you have a bad hire until you have to fire them, right? But we want to make sure that you have that data to make that decision. If it doesn't work out, you have a reason why. But then you also don't punish the next supplier because of mistakes that happened previously, and especially when it comes to diverse suppliers. So we're making sure that you leave that situation there, and then going into your next situation, you still have the data to make a decision going forward. Because it's always going to be risk because you don't know who you're hiring or contracting with sometimes.
You're all about almost trying to mitigate as much risk as possible before you even enter into the relationship. Exactly. And you're using data as the means to do that. Exactly. Okay, wonderful. So Jung, what about you, risks?
Yeah, I definitely think that engaging with a new relationship and suppliers and vet them before going into the relationship definitely would mitigate some of the risk. What I would say is that the risk comes from everywhere, and it doesn't always have to be from the supplier. So going back to my point about just assuming the best intent, risk can come from not only them, but exterior factors. The other thing I will talk about is that you can't have a blind trust. I mean, when I work for a public company, and so even if I personally feel like I can trust a supplier based on the past records, I still need to protect my company from, facing potential risk. So my job is constantly to assess the risk, whether coming from geopolitical risk or tariff or any new chemical or sustainability related regulation. I don't mean that those regulations are risk, but it is a disruptor. So I constantly have to pay attention to what's happening in the world. And there's a war, there's pandemic. These are things that are not supplier related, but it impacts the whole supply ecosystem. So in terms of the risk specific to onboarding the supplier, we have a lot of measures within the company about compliance team checking them. We're sending the inspector to check them. I usually always go to check suppliers before we place a meaningful order, because data is important, but there's something that you can learn by going there and physically visiting and meeting the people in person. Especially having done this job for a long time, you can kind of pick up the things that the data wouldn't tell you otherwise. The other thing about the risk and what I do to manage that is that you can't do it blindly. You have to explain your expectation pretty clearly, because even if they have the best intent, if they don't understand your expectation very clearly, that can be measured. They can default without even knowing that they're damaging my end of business. So whether it's chemical testing, physical testing, or anything related to child labor, there are specific expectations that we convey very clear terms. I know fashion product is not something that you eat or consume, but as a really quick example, if you're wearing high heel that's produced by Michael Kors, and if the heel broke because it was not attached correctly, and if somebody fell and injured, I mean, that's a huge liability. So as much as we think, people may think that, oh, it's fashion product, it's kind of, but there's a lot of rigor and testing that go into making sure we explain the requirements, but also making sure we validate that that passes that requirement. So, that's how we manage the risk.
Interesting. So with seafood, I think there's a big health and safety risk, of course, with not properly caring for product through the supply chain, temperature-wise, age, and we want to be able to provide security by instant recall a product and track all of that information. But on a higher level, I think there's a risk of climate change and waste. And there's an opportunity for us to use these new tools to try to minimize these inefficiencies in our systems. I tell the story about, 46% of seafood is mislabeled. How could that possibly be? 50-50 chance you're getting what the label says you're getting. But when we look at, I know
everyone's like, ew.
Like, what are we eating? I don't even know.
I don't want to. I don't want to suppress seafood consumption, but this is a real risk. And when you want to incentivize good behavior, like certified products that are best aquaculture practices or marine stewardship certified products in the wild, why would anybody want to do that when there's a 50-50 chance that product's going to get switched out? They can't build their brand value. But with these new tools, we'll be able to track and lock in that value, and I think we can fight some of these huge challenges that we have.
And I think we'll get to the tools in a second, because y'all are up to some really cool things there. But really quickly, literally in a world where there's infinity risks, especially when you're dealing with an end-to-end supply chain, how do you personally in your day-to-day roles prioritize? How do you think about that? So with your clients maybe.
Yeah, so with our customers that we work with, we work across industries from retail to hospitals to education. And so we see it from so many different avenues of helping them understand the suppliers that are in their supply chain, all of the data that's available, even making site visits. We say, don't just look at the data if they are producing a product for you. But also if they're switching to local suppliers, you have the ability to visit a lot sooner than if you were purchasing from another country or city. So really just adding to the data for that decision, and then externally adding to their supply chain. So we're seeing risk from so many different avenues, whether they're buying new software products to physical products to services. And then also figuring out why they still have certain companies on their balance sheet for such a long time that should have probably been off their balance sheet at this point. So we've been seeing it across the board and making sure that they understand how to go beyond just a transactional relationship.
Yep.
As you asked earlier, who's strategic to you as your suppliers? And I think just over the last few years, people understood what that meant. Most times it was just transactional. I'm getting this product, I'm getting this service from them. But I'm like, this is your external team. You're spending more with them than you are anything else on your balance sheet. They should be your partners. Those should be the people that you're speaking to as regularly as you're speaking to your customers, as regularly as you're speaking to your employees. So we've been able to help them create those different goals that, to place on the platform. We're looking to source locally. We're looking to diversify our supply chain. We're looking to save money. We're looking to save time. We're looking to go sustainable by 20, whatever year you choose. It varies across the companies. So we've been able to help with that, but allowing data to help with that decision making and taking some of the biases out of it, that it may be more expensive to be sustainable, it may be more expensive to be local, things of that nature.
I think it's so interesting that you mentioned things like you're talking about time, money, effort, resources. And I think what a lot of salespeople and other people don't realize about the entire sales process is that, yes, you're selling an outcome that will help a business do better work, but you're selling those things. You're selling the things that really make an impact on the end user humans. And so I love that you made that point about your relationships with your suppliers, because that should be reciprocal. But so, Jung, how do you prioritize?
Right. I think just going back to the data point, because it's a good segue, is that having lots of data points are important because you don't know where the risks are going to be coming from. So as much as data you have available, when unforeseen risks present itself, you can sort of manage through it based on information you already have. So for example, and I think the data maintenance takes time. I mean, you need staff, you need the time, you need the equipment to be able to gather all the data. And I think amount of data you have for the company really represents what your company value and what you consider it to be important. So for example, during COVID, I really didn't have a lot of concern around understanding where the risks are, because our company always put really the highest value in product integrity and wanting to know what ingredients and what materials go into the finished product. And I'm wearing Michael Kors shoes. I know every single material on here, from the shoelace to the tip to this material, and also every one of them, who's a supplier, where it's coming from, what the lead time is, and what's the cost. So it's really uncommon in fashion industries to be managing the information all the way down to the second and third tier supplier. We know where the glue's coming from. We knew where the threads are coming from. This is a level of detail we care about. So we've always done that, and we've always had maintained that data just for ourselves, because we care about the experience of our customer, and that's how we build the trust with our brands, that we had that already. So if you have it, you can really do a lot of analytics. When Vietnam's closed for shutdown, I know immediately which suppliers shut down. I don't need to call them to find out. I don't need to read the news to know that. So that really helped me manage the risk as COVID is moving through different countries and even different regions within the country. I was able to identify what the risk might be and have my own game plan. So data is important, but accumulating the data itself as a company does take a lot of time and effort. You don't know when it'll come into the real use. So I do see a lot of, my peer brands after COVID, now we're going to find out who the second and third tier suppliers are now. Okay, I don't know if there will be another COVID exactly like that, So I think really the data is so critical, but it's too late if you start when you see the risk. So I think what I do now, besides the data, is just really paying attention to macroeconomics and geopolitical issues and talking about the sustainability. We produce our product, depends on what it is, really from all over, from Europe to Asia to South Asia. And I think that really paying attention to what's happening in the world. Is there a war between Europe, in Russia and Ukraine? Obviously, that's going to have an impact. Now, okay, I mean, this is so crazy that I'm a fashion person and thinking about this, but Russia and Ukraine is, number 1 or 2 exporting region of the wheat. And at that time, I was reading a lot about, so this is last year, I was reading a lot about how that is going to create the food crisis, food shortages in less than fortunate countries. And those are sometimes the region where the leather can be coming from, or, or manufacturing can be happening. Not all, but certain things. And so because all my raw material, like I said, I know where they're all coming from, whether it's thread or glue, that I think about it all the time. What is happening in the world that can affect the people there? There's definitely a people element. If there's a food shortage, that's a problem for the people, because food shortage is number one risk for civil unrest. So what if there's a civil unrest, like Myanmar? Okay, that's a problem for garment industry. So I pay attention to all of those geopolitical issues, the health concerns, sustainability, because global warming is real when you live in a country that's tropical. They're already feeling it. There's a lot of weather inconsistency where people can't come to work. I mean, these are real challenges for global manufacturing in the network. So we have the data, but I constantly pay attention to what could be the potential risk for next year and start gathering the data about that and information about that now to be ready.
But I'm just sure that your suppliers appreciate that you're thinking holistically about their businesses. You're not just like, where's my stuff? You're thinking, how are your people?
Right. So, I mean, I really felt that during really tough situation like COVID, when people are getting sick and dying, and honestly, really approaching my suppliers not as a transactional buyer, but really as a partner, being concerned for them. I think it really resonated with them. I mean, our company always had a great partnership with the suppliers because we select the suppliers who, again, have the best intent and mutual respect for success. But that philosophy really paid off during COVID, where maybe other brands are not getting the product. I was getting my product because I can call the owner, and there's definitely a human element when there has to be a people's will and desire to do a good job. And that really, I mean, the data is important, and I think KPI would speak to that. With that motivation, of course, they're going to achieve A+, right? But at the end of the day, I think the reciprocal respect and relationship and genuine concern for each other's success and well-being, I think that is so critical.
I fully agree, and I think especially when you're looking at those behavioral elements that prove trust, that is key, is the care, right? It's mutual care and respect. So I want to move on because I know, Donna, you have some really cool things to say about technologically, like how you're addressing some of these risks. So what are some of the ways that people address risk via tech? So I'm sure there are some people in the audience out there, Jung, who are saying like, oh my God, you're doing witchcraft and wizardry. We could never do that in our supply chain. But how did you start thinking about that multi-tier visibility, and where's that coming from? So Donna, I do want you to start actually though, because you're doing some really cool traceability stuff.
My pleasure. So, and it goes back to the building of trust and priorities, and for Mana, our priorities really clarified around the permitting of offshore aquaculture. Because if you think about it, it incentivized us to commit to 100% transparency. We're going out into the ocean where we want everybody to watch and see that we're not putting chemicals in, that we're not. So that's a collaboration then that was built around that transparency. So you have to have the trust first, and then the 37 federal and state agencies that I'm working with to permit offshore aquaculture have to all collaborate and accept that and get on the same page as to what they want to see in the operation, the size, the feed, the care and practices that we'll be doing. So having committed to that transparency and having experienced that collaboration over the last 7 years that I've been working on these offshore permits, it became a natural segue to take that into the technology side and start looking for collaborations within the seafood supply chain. So what we did just to learn was we traced a tuna from Montauk out on eastern Long Island and wanted to see what happened to the tuna. So 650-pound tuna caught off of Montauk, bought by a broker on the dock. Broker sells it to another broker. Second broker freezes it, brings it to Japan, goes to Japan, it's auctioned off at Japan. It then goes, gets bought at the auction by a broker who sells it to a distributor. That distributor then brings it back to New York into Fulton Fish Market. It gets purchased by a distributor at the fish market and then ends up back in a restaurant on Long Island. 6 months later, then the money trickles back to the fisherman who's told, you're only getting this much because somewhere along the line they didn't chill your fish properly. So there's problems, and identifying the problems and looking at how these tools, collaboration, trust, blockchain, which locks in that trust and really is something I think consumers can understand, no matter where they are. I have had friends who are distributors of seafood out in Montauk who, everybody knows about conspiracy law. I happen to be a lawyer farmer, but when you have a conspiracy, every co-conspirator is guilty of the crime of each and every co-conspirator. So if you're buying illegal fish and you don't know it, you're guilty of the crime of, it could be a RICO crime, transporting illegal product, part of a conspiracy. It's horrible. And so these guys got fined and criminal charges, $250,000 fine. I mean, this is a service. This is something that needs to be brought into the supply chain. It needs to be, people need to know on the liability end what they're buying and selling. But on the consumer end, the consumers want to know too, what is it that they're eating? Is it skate or is it really a scallop? Or is it a scallop cut out of skate? I don't know. So we're working on tools now to species authentication tools, temperature tracking, carbon footprint tracking, anything we can add to the value chain to build brand value and to ensure safety and build trust.
I'm not going to eat any seafood.
Right? Well, unless I catch it myself.
Right, or until I know it's been used by her too.
Exactly.
I kind of wanted to say that, this is really the example of what kind of supplier I would be meeting and be trusting, right?
Right.
Because, when the buyer, there's a lot of dynamics such as buyer want to enforce something because you don't trust them, right? And then they these are my rules and you need to prove it, with the blockchain and this and that. That's very costly for everybody to implement that, and it takes time if there's no desire and goodwill from the supplier. So, I always look for someone like you in my suppliers where, they're proud of their what they're producing. They're proud. They don't want theirs to be mixed with other sub-quality product to be misunderstood that it's theirs. And so really this is, again, going back to the integrity, and that, it's so important to partner with somebody with that integrity, whether there's a blockchain technology to prove that or not, So this is sort of the good example of what I see in our suppliers that I respect, where, our competitors started to say, sustainability, our leathers, all coming from LWG certified tanneries. Leather Working Group is an organization that governs and accredits the tanneries on their chemical processing and many other social elements and how clean it is that leather is produced. Obviously, it's great. I knew that we're working with great people and the suppliers. You can see that when you go, the conditions that people are in. You can witness what's going on, but we didn't have that data. But our competitor was saying, our suppliers are like 75% LWG certified. Oh, wow, great. Well, I found out by checking the data, which that was not a data point that I had at the time because I knew it was good, but didn't have the number. And ours is now 98%. So it is sometimes the trust is not completely blind, but over time you can really recognize the common value that we both share with the supplier and within the supply chain.
Tying it in kind of like the digital measurement. So you've mentioned that you have all of this wonderful data for you to use and pull and make decisions with, but where do you keep it? How do you access it? How do you organize it? You had talked about the resources needed to maintain good data, but when we actually think about digital infrastructure necessary to do that, walk us through what that looked like for you and getting that truly set up, especially with that multi-tier visibility. Yeah, anyone, yeah.
So it's actually quite intense, but there are many ways to do it. So we have a system where PLM system, and many brands make it, but it's product lifecycle management system. And different companies employ different softwares, but basically it starts from logging all the raw material information first, and then you also log all the design images and concept all the way through commercialization process about what you check for fit, technical specs. All of those are housed in the system in centralized place, and it's a web-based. So once certain items are being used for the product, my product development team can pick, okay, this glitter is this one. And so you basically, it's like a shopping cart, and you bring all that in, and basically all the costs, where it's coming from, weight, anything you have to know about each and every materials you can see in one place with the sketch. And it is obviously first quite labor intensive to manage it. But again, only if the company believe that that's important, you would allocate the resources to support it.
Yeah.
There are many ways that we have evolved. Initially, it was all done manually in-house, but there are ways to collaborate with the suppliers that to a certain degree, they would enter the information themselves, and then we can review, and we'll add something that we need to based on what Michael Kors needs from that attributes. But any and every attributes about every single material, whether it's a thread or anything else, can be really supplied by the suppliers, so that it's a great collaborative tool that suppliers want you to know all about their materials, so that's how we collaborate. And that's how we know the costing, where it's coming from, consumptions of every single materials that's on it. So
Very cool. And Tiffanie, what are you doing with Stimulus?
Yeah, so similar. So you go, you spoke a lot about like caring and trust and looking at the risk a little too late. So when we first start working with customers, we make sure that they go back as far as they can go when it comes to putting data on the Stimulus platform, so we can do a full audit of all of their suppliers. How long you've been working with them? Are you spending with them? Are they inactive? Are they active? Why are you still spending with them? Should there be other suppliers that you're adding to your supply chain? Looking at the risk factors, looking at any type of review that you can do on those suppliers to say, this is why we're working with them, this is why we may not work with them in the future. So you're starting with that starting point. So then as you're working with them going forward, not only can you manage your tier ones, but the tier ones can put their tier twos and tier threes on the platform to really showcase that relationship. We really focus on the intelligence of the relationship, so not even just showing you that, yes, these companies are vendors, but being able to show you, are these companies that you're working with customers of yours? What other relationships do you have with them? So you can gain that trust, add additional trust to that relationship over time to make sure that you're tracking that entire project from start to finish, and then being able to really give them an evaluation at the end. And then you see that going forward on from risk to product to services to whatever it is that you're working on with them across different attributes. And then also being able to do that with the tier twos and the tier threes, because at the end of the day, those tiers are affecting that tier one that would eventually affect you. So again, going back into knowing risk before it happens, if something happens with their tier two and the tier one can't get their work done, then that buyer is going to be affected across the board. So being able to see that quite early. And then we collect up to 90 plus data points across the entire suppliers on our supply chain for their digital profiles. And we do that for so many reasons. One, making sure that it's not just transactional information that you have on them. Like I said, understanding if they're a customer of yours, if they're already using and buying from Michael Kors, hey, would they be a great vendor? Do they know your product inside and out because they're wearing it? They're a consumer as well, right? And then looking at other things about their leadership, looking at things about their board, looking at where they're buying these different materials for their products. All of that information at your fingertips, so you're understanding that relationship, where it is and where it can grow into. So really understanding the importance of risk before you even work with them, but then as you're working with them as well.
Excellent. And so we've spent a lot of time talking about this bright, lovely future and all the wonderful things we're doing to make everything perfect in the world, right? But I think a lot of the events I go to like to focus on the hero story. But what are some of the stumbling blocks? What are some of the just utter abject failures that you've seen in the world? And I think it's helpful to talk about those too and kind of the lessons learned.
People don't like change.
Yes.
And it's hard to change. And in the seafood space, there's just so much mistrust, and everybody's siloed, compartmentalized. They don't want to share their information, although through sharing is where we can be more efficient. So I think it's just
Like an opening up of communication channels and
a lack of understanding about the potential benefits that might be reaped by collaboration. Everybody's used to doing their own thing.
interesting.
Yeah, what I'm seeing is definitely, to your point, not liking change, just starting. I'm sure you're hearing digital transformation everywhere. So that's the same thing as suppliers. They would have the same 5, 10 suppliers forever if they could, for whatever reason, good or bad, just so they don't have to go through the process of looking for a new supplier, building a new relationship, all of those different things. And then the tools, right? You know, we're built on API just to make sure that we can integrate with tools if they are using those tools. Some are still using a lot of Excel and Word documents as well. So making sure that not only are you open to change, open to changing your supplier, expanding your supply chain, but then also looking at the tools that can connect to or upload an Excel file if you need it, to make sure across the board that you are streamlining your processes, building those relationships, tracking those relationships, and knowing that this can help you in the long run work better with your suppliers, because we've seen so many updates when it comes to how you work with your customers, how you work with your employees. But for whatever reason, on the supply chain side, they still want to be a little old school. So we're trying to fix that and say, hey, this is your team, this is your external team. You care about them. Hopefully they care about you. Because like you said, if you can call them and not wait for an email during something, you know, that's happening in the world, that's a real relationship that you want to keep.
One of the learning, I wouldn't say it's a failure, is that I think the value and trust and integrity that you apply to your team and yourself should not be assumed for everyone. I think that's one thing I will say. And the other thing is that although you assume the positive intent and everyone's intention's good, sometimes there is an ability question and that they might just not be there and could drop the ball, right? So I think that is really where the biggest challenge was during COVID. Again, like we have this great data and, you know, I was able to mitigate a lot of the risk and have the goods be ready in all kinds of crazy circumstances. But what I didn't have the knowledge of, or what I didn't really know too, is that like back end, like the goods need to be picked up. And there was the whole container shortages and things
that
like
part.
that, right? Oh, that part. So at any given time for 1 week during the worst of the times, when container went from like $3,000 to like $30,000 during COVID, I mean post-COVID, during COVID, I think you assume, because I had it ready, you know, like factories are ready. Everyone collaborated to make it happen, but it's not really, it hasn't happened until it's shipped here on the shelf and ready to be sold. And I think that really big gap, I think the collaboration piece, you can't just excel in the area you manage, but you also need to make sure that it's all the way through. Like if you really care about the customer, I care about the quality, production timing, and provide the value through the costing, but it just needs to be here to be sold. And so I think really like sort of expanding what do I care about ultimately, our customer, and to really caring about what's happening with my shipment all the way to the end. I think that was sort of the failure, but my learning.
That's a really good one.
That was a good one.
So as we wrap up here, I think my biggest takeaways are gather data, but really trust but verify that it's the right data. Really care about your suppliers, care about their lives outside of them supplying you with goods and services. And then communication is key, right? Over-communicate all the time, but also that tech can do great things for supplier relationships as well as like an underlying wave. So I'll leave it there. Any questions from the audience? I'd like to really thank my panelists and writers for having us. Silence. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.